There are moments that feel so small at the time, so innocuous, that you don't realize their significance until much later. For me, it started with something as simple as a dress. Victor and I were hosting one of his famous dinner parties, a meticulously planned affair filled with his business colleagues and their equally polished spouses. I'd chosen a navy blue cocktail dress, sleek and understated, but elegant enough to fit in with Victor's high-achieving crowd. The zipper, however, had other plans. I stood in front of the mirror, twisting and reaching, trying in vain to pull it up. The angle was impossible, and Victor, as always, was already too busy on a call to help. Frustration bubbled inside me as I fumbled with the stubborn fabric. "Need a hand?" The voice startled me, and I turned to see Adrian standing in the doorway. He held a casual ease about him, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans. Yes, actually," I admitted, my cheeks flushing. He stepped closer, his expression calm but focused. "Turn around," he said softly. I obeyed, holding my breath as his hands found the zipper. His fingers brushed against my back as he pulled it up slowly, the touch sending an unexpected shiver down my spine. "All done," he said, stepping back. I turned to thank him, but the words caught in my throat when our eyes met. There was something in his gaze, something unspoken but undeniable, that made my heart race. "Thank you," I managed, my voice softer than I intended. He nodded, lingering for a moment before turning and walking away. As I watched him go, I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to calm the rapid thudding of my heart. It was just a zipper, I told myself. Just an innocent moment. But deep down, I knew better. The dinner party went off without a hitch. Victor schmoozed, his guests laughed at all the right moments, and I played the role of the supportive, perfectly put-together wife. But the entire evening, I felt like I was operating in a haze. Adrian's touch lingered in my mind like a whisper, faint but insistent. I found myself stealing glances at him from across the room, trying to convince myself that what I'd felt had been a fleeting moment of vulnerability. He was polite, reserved even, keeping mostly to himself throughout the evening. But when our eyes met briefly over the rim of my wineglass, my pulse quickened. The next morning, I woke early, hoping to shake off the strange energy that had gripped me. The house was quiet, with Victor already gone to an early meeting. As I stood in the kitchen brewing coffee, Adrian walked in, his hair slightly mussed, wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough from sleep. "Good morning," I replied, trying to sound casual. He grabbed a mug and poured himself some coffee, leaning against the counter as he took a sip. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged. "Last night went well," he said, finally breaking the quiet. "Yes," I replied, though my thoughts were miles away. "Victor always loves hosting those parties." Adrian chuckled softly. "It's not really your scene, is it?" I glanced at him, startled by his observation. "What makes you say that?" He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "You just seemed different, like you were putting on a show." His words hit closer to home than I cared to admit. "That's part of the job," I said lightly, trying to deflect. "You shouldn't have to perform for people," he said, his tone sincere. "You're better than that." The earnestness in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt my cheeks flush. Before I could respond, he set his mug down and headed toward the door. "See you later," he said over his shoulder, leaving me alone with the thundering of my heart. Over the next few days, I tried to create distance between us. I kept myself busy with errands and chores, avoiding being alone in the same room. But it seemed like Adrian was everywhere, offering to help carry groceries, fixing a squeaky cabinet door, or simply lingering in the kitchen while I cooked. It wasn't just his presence that unsettled me. It was the way I noticed him now. The way his laughter lit up a room, the subtle strength in his movements, the kindness in his eyes when he spoke to me. The tension between us came to a head one afternoon when we were in the living room. I was rearranging some books on the shelf, and he was lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone. "You don't have to do all that," he said, setting his phone aside. "I like keeping things organized," I replied without turning around. He stood and walked over, standing just behind me. "Here," he said, reaching up to grab a book on the top shelf that I couldn't quite reach. His arm brushed against mine, and I froze, the proximity sending a jolt through me. "Thanks," I said quickly, stepping back. "You're welcome," he said softly, his gaze locking with mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. The space between us felt charged, like a wire stretched too tight, ready to snap. Adrian, I began, my voice trembling. We can't. I know, he said, cutting me off gently, but it's hard to ignore. I looked away, my chest tightening. We're not having this conversation. He nodded, stepping back to give me space. Okay, but if you ever want to, I'm here. His words hung in the air long after he left the room. That evening, I found myself lingering in the garden, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. The roses I'd planted years ago were in full bloom, their scent filling the evening air. You like it out here, don't you? Adrian's voice startled me, and I turned to see him standing a few feet away. I needed some quiet, I said, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. He nodded, stepping closer. I get it, it's peaceful. We stood in silence for a moment, the soft chirping of crickets, the only sound. Then he spoke again, his voice low. You don't have to do this alone, you know, he said. I turned to him, frowning. What do you mean? You take care of everything, he said, his eyes searching mine. The house, Victor, the parties. But who takes care of you? His question left me speechless. No one had ever asked me that before, not even Victor. I can take care of myself, I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. I don't doubt that, he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. But maybe you don't have to. The sincerity in his words made my chest ache, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek before I could stop it. Adrian, this is complicated, I said, my voice trembling. I know, he said softly, but that doesn't mean it's not real. For weeks, the air in the house felt different. Every glance Adrian and I exchanged, every shared space, seemed charged with an unspoken energy we couldn't escape. I told myself it was nothing, that it would pass if I ignored it. But denial was useless when every stolen moment only pulled us closer. One sunny afternoon, Adrian was outside mowing the lawn while I pruned the rose bushes along the garden path. The hum of the mower filled the air, punctuated by the rhythmic chirping of birds. I focused on snipping dead stems, but my attention drifted to Adrian as he moved across the yard, his shirt sticking to his back in the heat. Need some water? I called, forcing my tone to stay light. He turned off the mower, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. That'd be great, he replied, flashing me a grateful smile. I went inside to grab a glass of iced water, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't explain. When I returned, he was sitting on the garden bench, the mower forgotten. Here, I said, handing him the glass. Thanks, he said, taking a long sip. I sat beside him, wiping dirt from my gloves. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he broke the silence. You've been avoiding me, he said, his voice steady but tinged with something unspoken. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. I've been busy, I said finally. He set the glass down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. You don't have to lie, Lorraine. I can feel it too. My breath caught, and I turned to look at him. His expression was open, vulnerable, and it made my chest ache. This, whatever it is, I said, gesturing between us, it's dangerous. I know, he said softly, but that doesn't make it any less real. The tension came to a head one evening when Victor announced he'd be gone for a week on a business trip. Another deal in Chicago, he said over dinner, barely glancing up from his phone. You'll manage without me, right? Of course, I replied, my voice even. Adrian said nothing, but I could feel his gaze flick to me briefly. After Victor left, the house felt emptier, quieter, but not in the comforting way it usually did. That night, I found Adrian in the kitchen, leaning against the counter as he scrolled through his phone. Can't sleep? I asked, my voice soft. He looked up, setting his phone aside. Not really. Me neither, I admitted, pouring myself a glass of water. We stood in silence for a moment, the stillness of the house wrapping around us. Then he spoke. Lorraine, he began, his voice hesitant. I don't want to make things harder for you. You're not, I said quickly, though the words felt hollow. I think I am, he said, stepping closer. Every time I'm near you, I can't stop thinking about everything I shouldn't be thinking about. His honesty took my breath away, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Adrian, this can't happen, I whispered. But it already is, he said, his voice breaking. I shook my head, stepping back. We have to stop this before it gets out of hand. He nodded slowly, though his expression was pained. If that's what you want. But as I turned to leave, his voice stopped me. Do you want me to leave? he asked quietly. I froze, my heart pounding. When I turned back to him, the look in his eyes undid me. No, I admitted, my voice barely audible. Over the next few days, we found ourselves drawn together in small, seemingly innocent ways. We worked in the garden, cooked dinner together, and shared long conversations late into the night. Each moment felt like a step closer to the line we both knew we shouldn't cross. One evening, after dinner, we sat on the back porch, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the yard. Tell me something, Adrian said, his tone light. Like what? I asked, taking a sip of wine. Something about you, he said, his gaze steady. Something you don't tell anyone else. I hesitated, unsure what to say. I don't know, I said finally. I'm not sure there's much to tell. I don't believe that, he said with a small smile. I looked away, my chest tightening. Sometimes I feel like I don't know who I am anymore, I admitted. Like I've spent so much time being what everyone else needs that I forgot who I was supposed to be. His smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet understanding. I know the feeling, he said softly. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared vulnerability settling between us. Lorraine, he said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. You don't have to keep pretending with me. His words made my chest ache, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek before I could stop it. Adrian, this is so complicated, I said, my voice trembling. Life is complicated, he said, his tone gentle, but that doesn't mean we should ignore what's real. A few days later, Helen, a close family friend, stopped by unexpectedly. Just thought I'd check in, she said brightly, stepping into the house with a bottle of wine. Victor's out of town, I said, forcing a smile. Perfect timing, she said with a laugh. Girls' night. Adrian appeared in the doorway, his expression neutral. Helen, he said politely. Adrian, she replied, her tone warm but slightly teasing. Still hanging around, I see. He smiled faintly but said nothing, retreating back upstairs. After a glass of wine, Helen leaned closer, her expression turning serious. You and Adrian seem close these days. Her comment sent a jolt through me, but I kept my face neutral. He's just been helping out around the house, I said casually. Of course, she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Her words stayed with me long after she left, a reminder of how precarious our situation had become. That night, I found Adrian in the garden, his hands deep in the soil as he tended to the roses. You're still out here? I asked, stepping closer. He looked up, brushing dirt from his hands. Couldn't sleep. Neither could I, but I didn't say it. Instead, I knelt beside him, the cool earth grounding me. We need to be careful, I said finally. I know, he replied, his voice quiet. But as our eyes met in the dim light, I realized that no amount of caution could stop what was happening between us. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that felt more like anticipation than peace. Victor was still out of town, and the house had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and dangerous. I couldn't focus on anything, my thoughts swirling with all the moments Adrian and I had almost crossed the line, but hadn't. I was in the living room, absent-mindedly flipping through a book I wasn't reading, when Adrian appeared in the doorway. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the frame, his presence filling the room. You're up late, he said finally, his voice soft. I couldn't sleep, I replied, closing the book. He nodded, stepping into the room. Neither could I. He sat down on the couch across from me, his gaze steady but unreadable. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy, like we were both waiting for something to happen. Lorraine, he said suddenly, breaking the quiet. I looked at him, my heart skipping a beat at the intensity in his eyes. What is it? I don't know if I can keep pretending this is normal, he said, his voice low but firm. My breath caught, and I set the book aside. Adrian, we've talked about this, it's just, don't. He interrupted gently. Don't tell me it's nothing. We both know that's not true. I looked away, my chest tightening. It's complicated, I whispered. Everything worth having is, he said softly. His words made my throat tighten, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. This, whatever it is between us, it can't happen, I said, my voice trembling. Why not? He asked, leaning forward. Because it's wrong, I said, though the conviction in my voice wavered. Does it feel wrong? He pressed, his tone gentle but insistent. I opened my mouth to respond but found I didn't have an answer. The room felt smaller, the space between us shrinking with every passing second. When Adrian moved to sit beside me, I didn't stop him. His presence was warm, grounding, but also intoxicating. "I see you, Lorraine," he said quietly. "Not the version of you everyone else expects, but the real you." His words unraveled me, and before I could stop myself, I turned to face him. "Adrian, this is dangerous," I said, my voice shaking. "I know," he replied, "but I don't care." When his hand brushed against mine, it was like a spark igniting a fire I'd been trying to suppress. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let him take my hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Tell me to stop," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. I couldn't. The kiss started slowly, tentatively, as though we were both testing the waters. But as I leaned into him, it deepened, a rush of emotions spilling over that I couldn't contain. His hands rested lightly on my waist, not grounding me even as my thoughts spun out of control. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless. I looked at him, my heart pounding. "We shouldn't have done that," I whispered. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice steady. I hesitated, my chest tightening. "No," I admitted. He nodded, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "Neither do I." The hours that followed were a blur of vulnerability and confession. We talked about everything. His frustrations with Victor, my loneliness in a marriage that had become more of a partnership than a relationship, the way we both felt seen by each other, in ways no one else seemed to understand. "You deserve to be happy," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "So do you," I replied, my voice breaking. His lips found mine again, and this time, there was no hesitation, no second guessing. The next morning, the house felt different. The tension that had lingered between us for weeks was gone, replaced by a sense of quiet intimacy. But with it came the weight of reality. As I stood in the kitchen making coffee, Adrian appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said, his voice soft. "Morning," I replied, handing him a mug. We stood in silence for a moment, the enormity of what had happened settling between us. "What happens now?" he asked finally, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I looked at him, my chest tightening. "I don't know," I admitted. He nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "I don't want to make things harder for you." "You're not," I said quickly, though the words felt hollow. He gave me a small, sad smile. "We'll figure it out." As the day went on, the reality of our situation began to sink in. I knew we couldn't keep this a secret forever. Victor would come home, and the fragile bubble we'd created would burst. But for now, I allowed myself to savor the stolen moments, his hand brushing against mine as we passed in the hallway, the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. But even as I reveled in the connection we'd found, a small voice in the back of my mind reminded me of the consequences. And I knew it was only a matter of time before we'd have to face them. For the next week, Adrian and I existed in a fragile, exhilarating bubble. We found excuses to spend time together, working in the garden, preparing meals, or sitting on the back porch watching the sunset. Every glance, every touch carried the weight of our secret, but we couldn't seem to stay apart. One morning, I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables when Adrian came in, a faint smile on his lips. "Need any help?" he asked, leaning against the counter. "I've got it," I said, glancing at him. He didn't move, just watched me with an intensity that made my hands tremble. "You're different when it's just us," he said suddenly. I paused, looking up at him. "Different how?" "You're lighter," he said softly. Happy his words hit me harder than they should have. "I guess I don't feel like I have to perform," I admitted. "You shouldn't have to," he said, stepping closer. "Not for me. Not for anyone." The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache, and I quickly turned back to the cutting board, trying to focus on the task at hand. But his presence was impossible to ignore. That evening, we sat on the back porch again, the air warm and still. I sipped a glass of wine, watching the way the light played across the yard. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Adrian asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. "Leaving?" I repeated, frowning. "This house, this life," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but it's not that simple." "Why not?" he asked, turning to look at me. "Because it's not just about me," I said. "There are expectations, responsibilities. None of that matters if you're not happy," he said, his voice gentle but firm. I looked away, my chest tightening. "It's not that easy." "It could be," he said softly. His words lingered in the air and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Adrian, I don't know how to. I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. You don't have to figure it out all at once, he said, reaching for my hand. But you deserve to be happy, Lorraine. You deserve to feel alive. The next day, a family friend, Helen, stopped by unexpectedly. Just thought I'd drop this off, she said, holding up a container of cookies as she stepped inside. Thank you, I said, forcing a smile. She glanced around the house, her sharp eyes taking everything in. Adrian still staying here? She asked casually. Yes, I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. She nodded, her expression unreadable. You two seem to be spending a lot of time together. The comment sent a jolt through me, but I kept my face neutral. He's just been helping out around the house, I said lightly. Of course, she said with a small smile, though something in her tone made my stomach twist. That evening, Adrian and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The house was quiet, and the weight of Helen's words hung heavily in my mind. She knows, I said quietly, breaking the silence. Adrian looked at me, his brow furrowing. Helen? She didn't say it outright, but I could tell, I said, my voice trembling. What did she say? He asked, his tone calm but serious. Just little things. Comments about us spending time together. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. We'll be more careful. Maybe this was a mistake, I said, my voice breaking. Don't say that, he said firmly, stepping closer. You don't mean it. I don't know what I mean anymore, I admitted, tears streaming down my face. He pulled me into his arms, his touch steadying me. Lorraine, look at me, he said softly. I did, my breath catching at the intensity in his gaze. This isn't a mistake, he said. What we have, it's real. The tension between us and the outside world grew sharper with each passing day. Victor called from Chicago one evening, his tone distracted but vaguely curious. How's Adrian doing? He asked. He's fine, I said, keeping my voice even. Spending a lot of time around the house, isn't he? Victor said lightly, though there was an edge to his tone. He's just helping out, I said quickly. Victor replied, and the line went quiet for a moment before he changed the subject. The close call came a few days later. Victor had said he wouldn't be back until the weekend, but I heard the sound of his car in the driveway late one evening. Adrian, I hissed, rushing into the living room where he was sitting. Victor's home. His eyes widened, and he stood quickly. I'll head upstairs, he said, his voice calm but urgent. Just as he disappeared up the stairs, Victor walked through the door, his expression tired but alert. You're back early, I said, forcing a smile. Meetings wrapped up faster than expected, he said, glancing around the house. Where's Adrian? In his room, I said quickly. Victor nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary before he turned away. That night, I lay awake, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I knew we couldn't keep this up forever. Sooner or later, the truth would come out, and the fallout would be devastating. But as I thought of Adrian, his touch, his words, the way he made me feel seen, I couldn't bring myself to end it. We were walking a tightrope, and I didn't know how much longer we could stay balanced. Victor's return was earlier than expected, throwing the delicate balance of the house into chaos. I had been careful, so had Adrian, but the inevitability of tension resurfaced the moment Victor walked through the door, his usual air of indifference replaced with something sharper. Home early, I said, feigning calm as I greeted him at the door. Deal wrapped faster than planned, he replied, his voice curt. Figured I'd surprise you. Surprise was an understatement. The timing of his arrival disrupted the fragile quiet Adrian and I had settled into. Adrian kept his distance that evening, retreating to his room while Victor paced the living room with a drink in hand, his demeanor more restless than usual. You've been quiet lately, Victor remarked, his eyes narrowing as he sat across from me on the couch. I've been busy, I replied, hoping my voice sounded neutral. With what? He pressed, his tone sharper than I expected. Just the usual. Keeping the house in order, running errands. I tried to keep my response light, but the weight of his gaze made my chest tighten. Adrian's been around a lot, he said suddenly, his words cutting through the air like a knife. He lives here, I replied evenly, though my pulse quickened. Victor leaned back, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He's an adult, doesn't he have somewhere else to be? I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Victor's eyes were piercing, as if he was searching for something just beneath the surface. The tension escalated the next morning when Victor walked into the kitchen, holding a book he'd found on the living room shelf. Inside it, a folded note slipped from between the pages, landing on the counter with a soft rustle. "What's this?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. My heart stopped. It was a note Adrian had written to me days ago, a simple thank you for a shared moment in the garden, but the familiarity in his words would raise questions Victor wouldn't ignore. "I don't know," I said quickly, reaching for it. Victor grabbed it first, his eyes scanning the page. His expression darkened. "Care to explain?" "It's nothing," I said, forcing a laugh. "Adrian must have left it by mistake." "By mistake," Victor repeated, his voice colder now. "Seems personal." Before I could respond, Adrian entered the kitchen. He froze, his eyes darting between us. "Something you'd like to share, son?" Victor asked, his voice sharp. Adrian's jaw tightened. "No, nothing at all." Victor held the note up. "Then why does this feel like more than nothing?" "Because you're overthinking," I interjected, stepping between them. "Victor, it's just a note. Let it go." Victor's gaze bore into me, and for a moment I thought he might press further. But instead, he dropped the note onto the counter and walked out of the room without another word. That evening, Adrian and I found ourselves in the garden, the tension from the day still lingering. "He's on to us," Adrian said quietly, his hands buried in his pockets. I nodded, my chest tightening. "I know." "We can't keep doing this," he said, his voice heavy with regret. My breath caught, and I turned to face him. "Adrian? This isn't just about us anymore," he continued, his tone firm. "If he finds out, really finds out, it won't end well for anyone." His words hit like a blow, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe it's time for me to go," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't stay here and make this harder for you." The thought of him leaving made my chest ache. But I knew he was right. The following morning, Adrian packed his things. I watched from the doorway as he folded his clothes into a suitcase, each movement deliberate, as if he was trying to hold himself together. "When are you leaving?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow," he replied without looking up. I stepped into the room, my heart pounding. "This doesn't have to be goodbye forever," I said, my voice trembling. He turned to me, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "Maybe not," he said softly, "but it has to be goodbye for now." When Adrian left the next day, the house felt emptier than it ever had. Victor seemed oblivious, his focus returning to work as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the hollow ache in my chest. That evening, I found the note Adrian had left behind on the counter. "Lorraine, I don't know how to say goodbye, so I won't. This isn't an end, it's just a pause. Thank you for everything. You've shown me more than I thought I'd ever see, and I'll carry that with me always. Take care of yourself. You deserve to be happy." "Adrian," tears blurred the words as I read them, the weight of his absence settling over me. I folded the note carefully, tucking it away in a place I knew I'd return to when the ache became too much. For now, all I could do was wait and hope. The days after Adrian left felt hollow. The house, once filled with a quiet tension that hummed with unspoken emotions, was now just quiet. Victor, oblivious to the storm that had nearly unraveled his life, returned to his usual habits: long hours at work, brief conversations over dinner, and nights spent scrolling on his phone. I went through the motions, cleaning, organizing, and maintaining the illusion of normalcy. But everything felt empty. The note Adrian had left became both a comfort and a torment. A reminder of what I'd lost and what I'd never truly had the courage to hold on to. Victor noticed the change in me eventually, though his observations were surface level at best. "You've been distant," he said one evening over dinner. "I've had a lot on my mind," I replied, keeping my voice even. "Anything I should know about?" he pressed, his tone more curious than concerned. "No," I said simply, taking a sip of water. He nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his plate. I realized in that moment how little he truly saw me. The realization didn't hurt anymore, it just was. Weeks turned into months, and I began to rebuild myself in small ways. I spent more time in the garden, tending to the roses Adrian and I had worked on together. Their blooms became a symbol of resilience, thriving despite the seasons of change. Diana, my best friend, noticed the subtle transformation in me. You seem different, she said over coffee one morning. Do I? I asked, a faint smile playing on my lips. Yes, she said, studying me. Lighter, almost. But there's something else too. What happened, Lorraine? I hesitated, then shook my head. Nothing I'm ready to talk about, I admitted. She nodded, her expression understanding. Whatever it is, I'm here when you're ready. One afternoon, as I was pruning the roses, the mail arrived. Among the usual bills and advertisements was an envelope with no return address. My heart raced as I opened it, recognizing the handwriting immediately. Lorraine, I hope this finds you well. I've settled into a new city, a new life. But I think of you often. The time we shared is something I'll always cherish. You showed me what it means to be truly seen, and I hope you found some peace too. Maybe someday, when things are different, our paths will cross again. Until then, take care of yourself. You deserve to bloom. Adrian, tears slipped down my cheeks as I read the letter, but this time, they weren't only tears of sadness. There was a bittersweet hope in his words. A reminder that life moves forward, even when it feels like it's standing still. Victor and I continued our uneasy dance of coexistence, but I no longer felt trapped by it. The connection I'd shared with Adrian had awakened something in me. A reminder that I deserved more than going through the motions. As I stood in the garden that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a quiet resolve settle over me. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, I was willing to find out. When I opened the door that Thursday morning, still groggy from a restless night, I didn't expect to find Daniel standing there. He had the kind of face you'd imagine belonged to someone in the prime of their life. Smooth skin, bright eyes, and just stubble to seem mature. He wore a white t-shirt that clung to his chest and arms, with a tool belt slung low over his hip. He held a clean-looking toolbox, its shiny red surface glinting in the morning sun. Everything about him, from his appearance to the nervous way he shifted his weight from foot to foot, screamed, "Too young for this." "You must be Ruth," he said, his voice soft but steady as he offered me a polite smile. "Yes, that's me," I replied, glancing down at my robe, tied securely but suddenly feeling too casual. "You're here to look at the window?" He nodded, his smile widening slightly. "Yeah, I got your message. The latch isn't closing properly, right?" "That's right," I said, stepping aside to let him in. As Daniel brushed past me, the scent of soap and sawdust trailed in his wake. It was a clean, masculine smell that lingered in the air. He walked with the quiet confidence of someone used to physical labor, but seemed a little unsure of himself, glancing around my house like he was afraid to touch anything. I couldn't blame him. It wasn't the kind of place young men probably visited often. The house was large and meticulously kept, but it felt empty, lifeless. It was a house meant for a family, not one lonely woman in her mid-50s. The high ceilings and spotless furniture were remnants of a time when this space had been alive with noise, with kids and conversations and love. Now it was just me and the quiet. "It's over here," I said, leading him into the sunroom, where the morning light spilled through wide glass windows. The faulty window was in the corner, and Daniel immediately set his toolbox down and got to work. I stood a few steps behind him, watching as he inspected the latch, his large hands deftly unscrewing the handle to examine its inner workings. His movements were careful but confident, and I found myself lingering, unable to look away. For a while, neither of us said much. The only sound was the occasional click of his tools and the birds chirping outside. I pretended to straighten up a stack of magazines on the coffee table, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. There was something fascinating about the way he carried himself, something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I hadn't had a man in my house since my husband died 3 years ago. I'd had plenty of time to adjust to life on my own, and for the most part, I thought I'd done well. But seeing Daniel here, his youthful energy filling the space, made me painfully aware of how quiet things had become. "You keep it really nice in here," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. He glanced over his shoulder at me, his eyes warm and sincere. "Thank you," I said, smiling despite myself. "I try to keep busy with the house. It's too big for just me, though." He nodded as if he understood, though I doubted he really did. He couldn't have been older than 27. What did someone like him know about empty houses and empty lives? I folded my arms and leaned against the doorframe, watching as he returned to his work. The sun streaming through the windows cast a golden glow over his tanned skin, making the veins on his forearms stand out as he tightened a screw. His hair, a sandy brown, curled slightly at the nape of his neck, damp with sweat from the warm morning. I felt something stir inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just attraction, it was a kind of longing, a faint echo of a feeling I'd thought I'd buried long ago. It was the way he filled the space, the way he seemed so alive. There was a vitality to him that I found myself drawn to like a moth to a flame. "Does this happen often?" Daniel asked, pulling me out of my thoughts. He gestured to the latch as he spoke. "Not really," I said, stepping closer to where he was kneeling by the window. "It's just old, like everything else in this house." He laughed softly, a low, pleasant sound that made my stomach flutter. "Old doesn't mean bad," he said, glancing up at me with a grin. His words hung in the air for a moment longer than they should have, and I felt my cheeks warm. I cleared my throat, suddenly self-conscious, and stepped back. "Well, as long as it still works, I suppose," I said lightly, trying to brush off the sudden tension. He nodded and returned to the window, but I noticed the way his hands moved a little more deliberately, as if he was trying to focus harder than necessary. By the time Daniel finished the repair, I felt both relieved and disappointed. Relieved because the momentary tension between us was starting to unnerve me, and disappointed because I didn't want him to leave just yet. "All done," he said, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. "Should be good as new now." "Thank you," I said, walking him to the front door. As he stepped outside, he turned back to look at me. For a moment, I thought I saw something in his eyes, a flicker of hesitation, like he wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. "Let me know if you need anything else," he said finally, his voice quiet but sincere. "I will," I replied, watching as he walked to his truck, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the morning sun. When the door closed behind him, the house felt even quieter than before. But this time, the silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite name. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, my mind replaying the way Daniel had looked at me, the way his laugh had made me feel like someone had flipped a switch inside me. I hadn't planned on feeling anything when I called him. It was just supposed to be a repair, nothing more. But as I walked back into the sunroom and sat down in the chair by the window, I couldn't stop thinking about him, his hands, his voice, the way his presence had filled the space. It was nothing, I told myself, a silly, fleeting thought. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure I wanted it to shift back. The next few days felt like they moved in slow motion. I went through the motions of my usual routines, watering the plants in the sunroom, sorting through the mail, and preparing dinner for one. But something was different. The house didn't feel quite as empty anymore. Daniel's presence lingered in the corners of my mind. I caught myself thinking about the way his hands moved as he tightened the latch on the window, the quiet hum of his voice as he worked, and the way he smiled when he spoke to me. It wasn't just his appearance, though that certainly hadn't gone unnoticed. It was the energy he carried with him, the way he seemed to bring life back into the house, if only for a little while. I told myself it was silly. He was just a handyman, the young man doing his job. There was nothing more to it. But even as I tried to push the thoughts away, they kept creeping back, uninvited. It didn't help that I found an excuse to call him again. The excuse was as flimsy as the supposed issue I'd discovered with the lock on the back door. It had been sticking slightly when I turned the key, but it wasn't anything I couldn't have handled myself. Still, I picked up the phone and dialed his number, my heart thudding in my chest as I waited for him to answer. "Hello?" His voice was soft, polite, but there was a hint of surprise when I introduced myself. "Hi, Daniel, it's Ruth. You came by the other day to fix my window?" "Of course, Mrs. Ruth," he said, the recognition clear in his tone. "Everything okay with the window?" "The window's fine," I replied quickly. "It's just, there's a problem with the back door lock now. It's probably nothing, but I thought it'd be better to have you take a look at it." There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment, I thought he might tell me he was too busy. But then he said, "I can be there this afternoon if that works for you." "That's perfect," I said, trying to keep the relief out of my voice. When Daniel arrived later that day, the same nervous energy I'd felt the first time returned, stronger now that I'd had days to dwell on it. He was wearing a navy t-shirt this time, paired with jeans that were slightly frayed at the edges, as if they'd been worn to dozens of other jobs. But on him, they looked perfect. I led him to the back door, explaining the issue in what I hoped was a casual tone. He nodded as I spoke, his eyes focused on the lock. "This should be a quick fix," he said, kneeling to inspect it. I stood nearby, leaning against the counter, watching as he worked. There was something about the way he moved, deliberate, confident, but not arrogant. It was the kind of confidence that came from someone who knew what they were doing but didn't feel the need to show off. "Do you do this kind of work full-time?" I asked, breaking the silence. He glanced up at me, his eyes warm but guarded. "For now, yeah, I've been doing it for a couple of years. Keeps me busy." "Do you enjoy it?" He shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's not bad. I like working with my hands, fixing things." I nodded, though I wasn't really listening to his words anymore. I was watching the way his hands moved, the way his forearms flexed as he tightened a screw. For a moment, I caught myself staring, and I quickly looked away, pretending to adjust the vase of flowers on the counter. But when I glanced back, I saw that Daniel had noticed. His cheeks were slightly flushed, and he was avoiding my gaze, focusing intently on the lock. The air between us felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken. I felt a rush of adrenaline, a mix of excitement and nerves that made my hands tremble slightly. "It's nice to have someone around who knows what they're doing," I said, my voice softer than I'd intended. Daniel looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "You probably could have fixed this yourself," he said with a small laugh. "It's a pretty simple job." "Maybe," I replied, stepping closer. "But I like having you here." The words hung in the air, and for a moment neither of us moved. Daniel's hands stilled, and he slowly looked up at me, his eyes wide and uncertain. I could see the conflict in his expression, the way he was trying to decide whether to stay or pull away. But he didn't move. I stepped closer again, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I knew I was crossing a line, but I didn't care. "Ruth," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes?" His gaze flicked to my lips, then back to my eyes. For a moment, I thought he might lean in, might close the distance between us. But then he shook his head, stepping back slightly. I should finish this," he said, his voice strained. I nodded, stepping back as well, though my body was still buzzing with the tension that hung between us. For the rest of the visit, we kept things strictly professional. Daniel finished fixing the lock, and I thanked him, my voice overly bright in an attempt to dispel the awkwardness. He packed up his tools and left, his goodbyes polite but hurried. When the door closed behind him, I let out a shaky breath, pressing my hand to my chest to steady my racing heart. I'd told myself that calling him back was about the door, but now I knew better. It wasn't about the lock, or the window, or anything else in the house. It was about him. And for the first time in years, I felt alive. The phone call came just a week later, but it wasn't about another repair. "Hey, Mrs. Ruth," Daniel said, his voice hesitant but warm. "I was just calling to check in. Is the door working okay?" The question was innocent enough, but the tone wasn't. There was a subtle crack in his professionalism, a flicker of something unspoken that I couldn't ignore. "The door's fine," I said, my voice steady, though my stomach fluttered. "But since you're asking, there is something else you might be able to help me with." There was a long pause, and I imagined him debating whether to take the bait. Finally he said, "What's going on?" "It's the light in the sunroom," I lied. "It keeps flickering. I think it's the wiring, but I'd feel better if you looked at it." "All right," he said slowly. "I can swing by this afternoon." When Daniel arrived, I could sense the change in him immediately. He was nervous, more so than the last time, but he was trying to hide it. His polite smile faltered as he stepped inside, and I noticed the way his hands fidgeted at his sides. "It's just the light fixture in here," I said, leading him to the sunroom. He nodded, setting his toolbox down and reaching for the switch. "I'll take a look." I lingered near the doorway, pretending to busy myself with the houseplants on the shelf. But my attention was fixed entirely on him, on the way his muscles flexed as he stretched up to inspect the fixture, on the way his jaw tightened in concentration. "How's it looking?" I asked after a few minutes, stepping closer. "It's probably just a loose wire," he said without looking at me. "I can tighten it up." He climbed down from the small step stool, brushing his hands off on his jeans. I watched him, unable to tear my eyes away from the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, the way his shirt clung to his back. "You've been a big help around here," I said softly, moving closer. "I don't know what I'd do without you." He froze for a moment, then turned to face me. His expression was guarded, his eyes searching mine as if trying to figure out what I meant. "It's just my job," he said, but his voice was quieter now, unsure. I stepped even closer, close enough to see the faint stubble on his jaw, the way his Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "Maybe," I said, my voice dropping. "But you've been more than that to me." Daniel's breath hitched, and I saw the conflict flicker across his face. His eyes darted to the floor, then back to mine, and for a moment, the tension between us was almost unbearable. "I don't think," he started, but his voice trailed off. I reached out, brushing my fingers lightly against his forearm. His skin was warm under my touch, and I felt the faint tremble in his muscles. "You don't have to think," I whispered. "Just let it happen." His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw the exact moment he gave in. His hands moved to my waist, hesitant at first, but growing firmer as he pulled me closer. His lips met mine in a rush of heat and urgency, the kiss clumsy and desperate but filled with a raw intensity that made my knees weak. I melted into him, my hands gripping his shoulders as I kissed him back, letting myself get swept up in the moment. His body was solid and warm against mine, and I felt a spark ignite deep inside me, a spark I hadn't felt in years. "Ruth," he murmured against my lips, his voice thick with need. "Shh," I said, tugging him closer. "Don't stop." He didn't. The sunroom wasn't enough for what was building between us. Without thinking, I led him through the house, down the hall to my bedroom. He followed, his hands roaming over my back, his lips trailing kisses along my jawline. By the time we reached the bed, the tension had boiled over into something we couldn't control. He pressed me against the mattress, his weight grounding me, his touch setting every nerve in my body alight. There was nothing tentative about the way he moved now. His earlier hesitance was gone, replaced by a kind of urgency that took my breath away. His hands explored my body with a mix of reverence and hunger, and I couldn't help but respond in kind, my own hands sliding under his shirt, tracing the lines of his back. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the bed, the room filled with the quiet hum of our breathing. Daniel's arm was draped over my waist, his fingers tracing lazy circles on my skin. "I shouldn't have done that," he said softly, breaking the silence. "Why not?" I asked, turning to look at him. He hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Because, I don't know, it feels like I crossed a line." I smiled faintly, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from his forehead. "We both crossed it." He nodded, but I could see the conflict still flickering in his eyes. "I don't want you to think I was taking advantage," he said, "or that this was just, I don't know, a fling." "I don't think that," I said firmly. "I wanted this as much as you did." He didn't respond right away, and for a moment we just lay there in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over us. Eventually, Daniel sat up, running a hand through his hair. "I should go," he said, his voice reluctant. "You don't have to," I said, though I knew he would. He shook his head. "I just need some time to think." I watched as he got dressed, his movements slow and deliberate as if he were giving himself time to process what had just happened. When he finally turned to leave, he paused at the door, glancing back at me. "Ruth," he said, his voice soft. "I don't regret it. But I don't know what this means." "Neither do I," I admitted. He nodded, his expression conflicted, then slipped out the door. The house felt impossibly quiet after he left. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I hadn't planned for this. I hadn't planned to feel anything for Daniel beyond gratitude for his repairs. But now, after what had just happened, I couldn't ignore the truth. I wanted him, and I wasn't ready to let him go. The hours after Daniel left were a haze of restless energy and unanswered questions. I paced around the house, replaying every detail of what had happened in my mind. The way he'd looked at me, the way his hands had trembled against my skin, and the way he'd kissed me like he was unraveling, unable to stop himself. It was intoxicating, yes, but it was also terrifying. I hadn't felt like this in years. This mix of exhilaration and vulnerability. For so long, I had lived in a world where emotions stayed buried, where I didn't allow myself to want anything more than what I already had. And then Daniel had stepped through my door, and suddenly, everything felt alive again. But now that he was gone, all that energy was turning into doubt. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. Daniel hadn't called, and I hadn't reached out either. Part of me wanted to. It would have been so easy to text him, to ask him to come back under the guise of fixing something else. But I didn't. Instead, I threw myself into distractions. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, reorganized the pantry, and even ventured out to a local bookstore, where I wandered the aisles aimlessly, not really looking for anything. Still, no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the lingering feeling of him. The warmth of his hands, the sound of his laugh, the way he'd whispered my name like it meant something. I told myself it was just a fling, a moment of weakness for both of us. But it didn't feel that simple. On the fourth day, just as I was beginning to think I wouldn't hear from him again, my phone rang. "Ruth?" he said, his voice hesitant but familiar. "It's Daniel." My heart raced, and I had to take a deep breath before I answered. "Hi, Daniel. How are you?" "I'm good," he said, though he didn't sound convincing. There was a long pause before he added, "I've been thinking about the other day." "So have I," I admitted, my voice softer now. He let out a shaky laugh. "Yeah, I figured. Look, I don't regret it, I need you to know that. But I don't know how to handle this." "Neither do I said honestly. "Can I come over?" he asked. The question caught me off guard, but I didn't hesitate. "Of course." Daniel arrived that evening, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, as if debating whether to come inside, before finally stepping in. We sat in the living room, the air between us thick with tension. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way his fingers fidgeted with the edge of his jeans. "I don't want you to think I'm running away," he said after a long silence. "But I'm scared of what this means." "What are you scared of?" I asked gently. He hesitated, his brow furrowing. "The age difference, for one, what people would think. And I don't know if I'm what you need. You're amazing, Ruth. You've got this life, this house, and you seem so put together. And me? I'm just a guy trying to figure things out." I reached out, placing my hand on his. His skin was warm, his fingers twitching slightly under my touch. "Daniel, I don't care what people think. And as for the rest, I'm not looking for perfection, I'm not even looking for promises. I just know that when I'm with you, I feel alive again, and that's enough for me." He looked at me then, his eyes softening. "You make me feel the same way, like I don't have to try so hard to prove myself." "Then stop trying," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He exhaled slowly, as if letting go of something he'd been holding on to for too long. "Okay," he said finally. "But I don't want to hurt you. I need you to know that." "You're not hurting me," I said, squeezing his hand. For the first time that night, he smiled. Over the next few weeks, Daniel and I found ourselves navigating the strange, uncharted waters of whatever this was between us. It wasn't a relationship, not in the traditional sense, but it wasn't casual either. He came over often, sometimes under the pretense of fixing something, sometimes just to sit and talk. We would spend hours together, talking about everything and nothing. I learned that he loved classic rock, that he'd spent 2 years working construction before transitioning to handyman work, and that he had an older sister who lived in another state. He learned about my late husband, about the children who visited only occasionally now that they had families of their own, and about the small dreams I'd abandoned over the years. Traveling, painting, learning to dance. Our connection deepened, but so did the complications. It wasn't long before the cracks began to show. One afternoon, as we sat together in the sunroom, Daniel mentioned his friends. "They don't know about us," he said, his tone cautious. "Should they?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's just, they wouldn't get it. They'd think it's weird." Weird? I repeated, feeling a sting of hurt. That's not what I mean, he said quickly. It's just, you know how people are. They judge, and I don't want them to think badly of you. I nodded, though his words lingered in my mind long after the conversation ended. The age gap, which had once felt thrilling, now loomed over us like a shadow. I noticed the way people stared when we went out in public. The cashier at the hardware store, the couple at the cafe. Their glances weren't overtly hostile, but they were noticeable. Enough to make Daniel shift uncomfortably and avoid meeting their eyes. At first, I brushed it off. But as time went on, I began to feel the weight of their judgment too. One night, after Daniel had left, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the empty wine glass in my hand. The house felt too quiet. The kind of silence that pressed in on me like a weight. I thought about what he'd said. About people not understanding. About their judgment. I couldn't blame him for feeling that way. I felt it too, in the stares and whispers, in the little voice in the back of my mind that kept asking, "What are you doing?" I told myself it didn't matter. That what we had was real, and that was enough. But the doubts were harder to ignore now, creeping into the edges of my thoughts like shadows I couldn't escape. And for the first time, I wondered if we were both in over our heads. It started small, like a crack in a window that's easy to ignore until it spiderwebs across the entire surface. Daniel began coming by less often. At first, it was subtle. He'd text to say he couldn't make it one day, but promised to stop by the next. And when he did come, he seemed distracted, his usual easy smile replaced with something tighter, forced. I told myself it was just life getting in the way. He was young, busy, probably juggling other jobs, maybe friends, maybe family. But deep down, I knew better. The hesitation in his voice, the way he avoided my gaze when we talked, it was all too familiar. One afternoon, I decided to address it. "Is everything okay?" I asked as he sat on the edge of my couch, his hands clasped together, his toolbox untouched by the door. "Yeah," he said too quickly. "Daniel," I said softly, reaching for his hand, "you've been distant. Talk to me." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "It's not you," he said after a long pause. "It's everything else." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then finally met my eyes. I didn't think this would get so complicated. The next blow came a week later. We had gone to a local hardware store together, something we'd done a few times before, though we usually kept a low profile. But that day, as we walked down one of the aisles, I noticed the way people were looking at us. It wasn't just the casual glances I was used to. This time, the stares lingered, and I could almost hear the unspoken questions hanging in the air. One woman, a middle-aged customer with a cart full of garden supplies, gave us a look that made my stomach twist. It wasn't overtly hostile, but it was judgmental, her eyes flicking between me and Daniel, as if she were trying to piece together what we were doing together. I tried to brush it off, but Daniel noticed too. I saw the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders stiffened as he avoided looking at anyone. When we got back to the car, the silence between us was heavy. "They were staring," he said finally, his voice tight. "Let them stare," I replied, though my own voice didn't carry as much conviction as I wanted it to. He shook his head, gripping the steering wheel. "It's not that simple, Ruth. They don't get it. They don't understand." "Why does it matter what they think?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Because it's not just them," he said, his voice rising slightly. "It's my friends, my family, people I know, people I care about. I don't want them looking at me like I'm doing something wrong." I didn't respond. There was nothing I could say that wouldn't sound defensive, and I wasn't sure I wanted to fight about it. But his words stayed with me long after the car ride home. The weeks that followed were a slow unraveling. Daniel became more distant, his texts fewer and farther between. When he did come over, it felt like there was a wall between us, an unspoken tension that neither of us wanted to address. I tried to act like everything was normal, but it wasn't. The laughter we used to share, the quiet intimacy of sitting together in the sunroom, it was all fading. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. "Daniel," I said, turning to face him. "What's going on?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know how to do this, Ruth. I don't know how to make this work." "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I care about you, he said, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and sadness. But it's not sustainable. The age difference, the way people look at us, it's always there hanging over me, and I don't know how to deal with it. I felt my heart sink, but I forced myself to stay calm. I don't care about any of that, I said. I care about you. I know, he said, his voice cracking. But I do. I can't help it. Every time I leave here, I feel like I'm living two lives, and it's tearing me up inside. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him that we could make it work if we just tried harder. But another part of me knew it wouldn't change anything. I never wanted this to hurt you, he said softly. I never wanted to hurt either of us. A few days later, Daniel came over for what would be the last time. I knew it as soon as I saw him standing in the doorway, his shoulders slumped, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't quite name. We sat in the living room, the same place where so much of our story had played out. But this time, the silence wasn't filled with anticipation or tension. It was just sad. I think we need to stop, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though the lump in my throat made it hard to speak. It's not because I don't care, he continued, his hands gripping his knees. It's because I care too much, and I don't want this to end in resentment or pain. I wanted to tell him that it was already too late for that the pain had already settled deep in my chest. But I stayed quiet, letting him say what he needed to say. You've been amazing, he said, his voice breaking slightly. You've shown me so much about myself, about what I want, but I don't think I can give you what you deserve. You gave me more than I expected, I said finally, my voice trembling. And I don't regret a single moment. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall. I don't regret it either. For a long time, we just sat there, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of us. And then, slowly, he stood, his movements hesitant, as if he didn't want to leave. Take care of yourself, Ruth, he said softly. You too, Daniel, I replied. And just like that, he was gone. The house felt impossibly empty after he left, the silence louder than it had ever been. I wandered from room to room, replaying our final conversation in my mind, trying to hold on to the pieces of him that were still here, the faint scent of his cologne, the indent on the couch where he'd been sitting. But as the hours turned into days, I knew I had to let him go. I had known from the beginning that this was temporary, that what we'd shared couldn't last. But knowing it didn't make it any easier. For days after Daniel left, I felt like I was drifting. The house, already too big for one person, now felt cavernous. I moved through it like a ghost, haunted by memories of him. Every corner seemed to hold a piece of us, a laugh we shared, a touch that lingered, a kiss that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. At first, I tried to keep myself busy. I cleaned the house obsessively, scrubbing the counters until they gleamed and reorganizing shelves that didn't need reorganizing. But no matter how hard I worked, the silence pressed in. It was the kind of quiet that gets under your skin, gnawing at the edges of your thoughts until you can't think about anything else. I missed him. More than I wanted to admit. I told myself it would get easier, that the ache in my chest would fade with time. But some mornings, I woke up expecting to hear his knock at the door, to see his nervous smile, and the way his hands fidgeted when he didn't know what to say. I started avoiding the sunroom. It was where so much had started, where the tension between us had first crackled to life. I couldn't sit in there without seeing him standing by the window, tools in hand, or hearing the faint echo of his laugh. Even little things became reminders. The hardware store bag on the counter, the faint scuff marks on the floor where he'd knelt to fix the back door lock, the toolbox catalog he'd left behind one afternoon. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I tried to rationalize it. This wasn't a breakup. Not in the conventional sense. Daniel and I hadn't made promises to each other. There had been no declarations of love, no plans for a future. What we had was fleeting, fragile, and built on borrowed time. But that didn't make it hurt any less. One night, unable to sleep, I sat down at the small desk in my bedroom and began to write. I didn't know what I intended to do with the letter, but the words poured out of me anyway. Dear Daniel, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. I miss you. I miss the way you filled this house with life. The way you made me laugh. The way you looked at me like I wasn't invisible. You made me feel seen in a way I hadn't been in years, and I'll always be grateful for that. I know we did the right thing by letting go. You have your whole life ahead of you, and I never wanted to hold you back. But I hope you know that what we had was real. It mattered. You mattered. Take care of yourself, Daniel. I'll always remember you. I folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer, knowing I'd never send it. The turning point came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I was sitting on the back porch watching the sun dip low on the horizon when it hit me. I didn't regret any of it. Not a single moment. Daniel had come into my life like a flash of lightning, illuminating everything I'd forgotten about myself. What it meant to feel desire, to feel wanted, to feel alive. And even though he was gone, the changes he'd sparked in me remained. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I began to reclaim my space. The sunroom, once filled with memories of him, became my sanctuary again. I bought a set of paints and started filling the blank canvases I'd kept stored in the closet for years. The vibrant colors felt like a reflection of the life I was rediscovering, piece by piece. I reached out to old friends I hadn't spoken to in years, reconnecting over coffee and long conversations. I joined a local book club, something I'd always meant to do but had never found the time for. Slowly, I began to fill the spaces in my life that had once felt so empty. Months passed, and the ache of missing Daniel began to fade. It didn't disappear entirely. Some nights I still thought about him, wondered where he was, what he was doing. But the memories no longer felt like a weight I couldn't carry. One afternoon, as I was tidying up the house, I came across the letter I'd written to him. I unfolded it, reading the words I'd poured onto the page so many weeks ago. This time, I smiled. I didn't feel the need to keep it anymore. Carefully, I tore the letter into small pieces and tossed them into the trash. Some things are meant to be let go. One evening, as I sat on the back porch with a glass of wine in hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The garden stretched out in front of me, the flowers blooming in bursts of color, the air filled with the hum of cicadas. I thought about the future, about the endless possibilities that still lay ahead. Daniel had reminded me that it was never too late to feel, to want, to live. And for that, I would always be grateful. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I raised my glass to the quiet, unspoken promise of tomorrow. Life was still waiting for me, and I was ready to meet it.